A homeless boy saves a billionaire's life by warning him about a bomb in his car. When the shocking truth about who planted it comes to light, the billionaire's next move leaves everyone stunned. A homeless boy saved the life of a billionaire by warning him about a bomb in his car. But when the shocking truth about who had placed it came to light, what the billionaire did next left everyone stunned. Richard and Ethan, two brothers who were born into a privileged family, had been inseparable. His childhood was filled with laughter, shared secrets, and dreams of building the family empire together. But over the years, their paths diverged drastically. Richard, the older brother, became a man of principle and humility. He took his inheritance and turned it into an even greater fortune, founding a company that became synonymous with innovation and integrity. His success earned him the admiration of his peers and the loyalty of his employees. Ethan, the younger brother, had always been more reckless. While Richard focused on building and maintaining his family's legacy, Ethan sought out quick thrills and risky adventures. His ambition, without the discipline that defined his brother, led him down a path of failed business and bad decisions. Each failure only deepened her resentment toward Richard, whom she saw as a constant reminder of her own shortcomings. Their parents, who had once kept them together, had passed away several years earlier. With his death, the brothers' relationship deteriorated further. They no longer spoke, except at festivals or events where the audience was waiting for their appearance together. These encounters were formal and tense, filled with superficial jokes that masked the growing gap between them. Richard, despite his success, often reflected on the distance that had grown between him and Ethan. He missed the bond they had shared as children and wondered if there was a way to reconcile. In moments of quiet introspection, he would tell himself that perhaps time would heal the wounds and bring them back together. Ethan, however, saw things differently. Every time she saw Richard's name on the news or heard about some other success of her brother, the bitterness inside grew. For Ethan, Richard's accomplishments were not a source of pride, but a stark reminder of his own failures. He convinced himself that Richard's success had come at his expense, which fueled deep resentment. As Ethan's financial problems piled up, his life got more and more out of control. He had accumulated huge debts from failed investments, and the pressure from creditors became unbearable. Their once strong connections in the business world had evaporated, and even those closest to them had begun to drift apart. Ethan's embarrassment prevented him from asking Richard for help. He could not bear the idea of admitting his failures to the brother whom he envied and despised. One sleepless night, while Ethan sat alone in his dimly lit apartment, the weight of his circumstances weighed him down. Despair took hold of his thoughts, and a dangerous idea began to take root. He told himself that there was only one solution to his problems, a way to escape the crushing burden of his debts and achieve the life he thought he deserved. The idea was horrible, but it consumed him. Ethan began planning the unthinkable, the murder of his brother. He rationalized it, convincing himself that Richard did not help him. He would argue anyway, that his success had come at Ethan's expense and that eliminating Richard was the only way to get back what he rightfully considered his. The plan gave Ethan a twisted sense of hope, the belief that his suffering would finally end once his brother left. Ethan had spent weeks watching his brother's routine closely, jotting down every detail with meticulous precision. I knew when Richard came to work, where he parked his car, and how long he usually stayed in the office. Every step of Richard's day had been catalogued in Ethan's mind, fueling the twisted plan that was now completely consuming him. Their desperation to find a way out of their mounting debts had eclipsed any remnant of a sense of morality or family bond. One warm weekday morning, Ethan decided it was time to execute his plan. He woke up early and began pacing back and forth in his apartment while mentally rehearsing every move. His heart was racing and his palms were clammy, but he convinced himself that he had no choice. With the materials he had prepared safely stored in a small bag, he made his way to Richard's company headquarters, his mind whirling with anxiety and anticipation. Richard, oblivious to danger, was already in his office, focused on the day's tasks. He had parked his luxury car in its usual spot outside the building, a sleek black vehicle that stood out from the row of smaller cars nearby. Ethan arrived soon after, parking his own vehicle some distance away so as not to attract attention. Dressed discreetly, Ethan made his way toward Richard's car, with quick, determined movements. He scanned the area as he approached, making sure no one was watching. The parking lot was practically empty at that time, with employees already inside the building and only a few passers-by in the vicinity. Ethan crouched near the back of Richard's car, his hands shaking slightly as he reached into his purse. He recovered the small explosive device he had assembled, a rudimentary but functional bomb designed to detonate when the car's engine was turned on. Carefully, he placed it under the vehicle, securing it in place with trembling hands. His heart pounded in his chest as he worked, every sound around him amplified by his exacerbated nerves. A distant honk left him paralyzed for a moment, lifting his head suddenly to make sure he wasn't being watched. What Ethan didn't notice was a pair of sharp eyes watching him from the shadows. Jamal, a homeless teenager who had been hanging around near the office, had seen Ethan approach the car. Jamal often wandered the area, looking for food or shelter, and his keen memory rarely failed him. He recognized Ethan at once as the man responsible for his father's downfall. Years earlier, Jamal's father had worked for one of Ethan's now-defunct companies. The business had collapsed under the weight of Ethan's illegal activities, leaving his employees without jobs and without resources. Jamal's father, unable to find a new job and consumed by despair, had taken his own life, leaving Jamal alone to fend for himself. The memory of his father's heartbreak was etched in Jamal's mind, and seeing Ethan again sparked a mixture of anger and curiosity. Jamal watched as Ethan finished placing the device and hurried away, his expression tense and determined. Although Jamal hadn't seen exactly what Ethan had done, he had a hunch that he wasn't good. He decided to stay nearby, keeping an eye on the car and waiting for its owner to return. Inside the building, Richard called off a meeting and prepared to go out for lunch. He gathered his belongings, exchanged a few kind words with his staff, and headed to the parking lot. His mind was occupied with thoughts of the day ahead, his attention focused on the tasks that still remained to be accomplished. As Richard approached his car, Jamal sprang into action. The boy rushed towards him, and his slender figure moved urgently as he yelled at Richard to stop. Startled, Richard stopped halfway, keys in hand, as he turned to look at the boy. Jamal, his voice trembling and urgent, begged Richard to listen. He explained that he had seen someone tampering with the car and that it was not safe to drive. Richard frowned, bewildered by the boy's frantic behavior. He had parked in the same place for years without any problems, and the idea of someone having his vehicle in his sights seemed far-fetched. Richard looked at Jamal's worn clothes and scruffy look, and his skepticism was evident. He smiled politely, assuming that the boy was wrong or that perhaps he was seeking attention. Jamal, undeterred, came over and repeated his warning, his eyes wide with despair. He pleaded with Richard to trust him and wait, insisting that something terrible would happen if he got into the car. Although he still had doubts, Richard decided to please the boy. He leaned against a nearby pole, looked at his watch, and prepared to go about his day. Jamal, relieved that Richard hadn't fired him entirely, stood a few feet away, staring intently at the car. The next moment changed everything. Without warning, a deafening explosion shattered the air. The force of the explosion sent a wave of heat and debris that knocked Richard and Jamal to the ground. Shards of metal and glass fell, and the remains of the once pristine vehicle were strewn across the parking lot. Richard's ears ringed as he tried to take in what had just happened. His car was wrecked, reduced to a pile of smoking rubble. The pungent smell of burning fuel filled the air and smoke rose in thick columns. Jamal scrambled to his feet, shocked but unharmed. He ran to Richard's side and helped him up while the older man watched the devastation in front of him. Understanding slowly became apparent, disbelief clouding Richard's expression as he turned to the boy. Jamal's earlier warning now sounded with chilling clarity, and Richard's skepticism was transformed into gratitude. Jamal explained what he had seen, in a firm voice despite the chaos around them. He described the man who had manipulated the car, his mannerisms and his appearance. As he spoke, Richard's heart sank. The description fit perfectly with the damned Ethan. Even with the evidence before him, Richard struggled to accept the truth. The thought that his own brother could have done something so heinous was almost unbearable. He went over the facts in his head, trying to find an explanation that didn't implicate Ethan, but the facts were undeniable. The boy who had saved him stood silently by his side, watching Richard deal with the reality of what had just happened. Jamal's presence was a stark reminder of the lives that Ethan's actions had already destroyed, and now, Richard's own life had all but added to that list. Although his heart was heavy with disbelief and pain, Richard knew he had to face the truth head-on. The bond she once shared with Ethan had been irretrievably broken, and she had no choice but to hold him accountable for her actions. Shocked but determined, Richard returned to his office after the explosion, his mind full of questions. The events of the day refused to take on coherence. How could someone have tampered with his car? And, more disturbingly, why would Jamal have described the author as his own brother, Ethan? Richard desperately hoped that the boy had made a mistake, that his brother was not capable of such an atrocious act. To clarify the situation, Richard decided to review the footage from the parking lot security cameras. His assistant, upon learning of the explosion, worked quickly to retrieve the recordings. Richard sat in his office, staring at the monitor as the images began to play. The first few minutes showed nothing unusual. Cars coming and going, employees entering the building. Then Richard dropped his heart out when he saw a figure approaching his car. Although the man wore a cap and tried to hide his movements, his gait and profile were unmistakable. It was Ethan. Richard moved closer to the screen, his breath raging. He played the recording over and over again, hoping to capture something that would exculpate his brother. Perhaps it was an effect of light or a coincidence in appearance, but the evidence was undeniable. Ethan was the one who had placed the device. Each repetition made Richard lose strength in his denial. The man on the screen, his own brother, had tried to kill him. Waves of disbelief, anguish, and rage washed over him as he stood motionless, staring at the damning images. Once the shock subsided, Richard's resolve hardened. Ethan's betrayal was unforgivable, but Richard needed to understand why. He decided to confront his brother directly, demand answers and hear the truth from Ethan himself. Later that night, Richard drove to Ethan's house without knocking first. The journey was tense, the silent hum of the engine failing to calm his thoughts. When he arrived, he got out of the car with deliberate and restrained movements. He had already alerted the authorities to his suspicions and called for backup, knowing that the situation could get out of control. The police waited discreetly nearby, ready to intervene if necessary. Ethan opened the door, clearly surprised to see Richard standing there. His face, initially pale with surprise, quickly transformed into a pretend masked warmth. He greeted his brother with an awkward smile, his tone overly cordial as he tried to hide his nervousness. However, Richard was not in the mood for jokes. He walked in uninvited, his piercing gaze fixed on Ethan. The air between them was fraught with tension, and Richard wasted no time in pulling out his phone and playing back the security camera footage. Ethan's face paled as he watched the video. His attempt to maintain a facade of innocence crumbled almost immediately. His eyes swept across the room in search of an escape route from the confrontation he had hoped to avoid. When the recording ended, Richard's voice was firm but cold as he demanded an explanation. The pain of betrayal was evident in his tone, but he refused to let it cloud his judgment. Ethan, cornered and unable to deny the evidence, stopped acting. His features twisted into a grimace of disgust as his latent resentment boiled over. He lashed out verbally at Richard, accusing him of arrogance and selfishness. His words were poisonous, brimming with years of bitterness and envy. He complained about how his parents had favored Richard, how the world had given him everything on a silver platter while Ethan was left alone. He accused Richard of accumulating wealth and success while ignoring his brother's suffering. Richard listened in stunned silence as Ethan's anger turned to incoherence. Although he knew about Ethan's problems, he hadn't realized the extent of his brother's hatred. The words hurt, but Richard stood his ground, unwilling to be dragged into an emotional argument. Ethan's tirade reached its climax as he growled, his voice trembling with rage. He declared that Richard was no longer his brother, just an obstacle in his life that needed to be removed. The venom in his tone confirmed what Richard had feared. Ethan's actions had been deliberate and fueled by deep-seated animosity. As Richard tried to defuse the situation, Ethan's anger erupted into violence. Without warning, he lunged at Richard, hands outstretched in an attempt to overpower him. The sudden attack forced Richard to take a step back, and his instincts kicked in as he raised an arm to block Ethan's advance. Fortunately, Richard's preparations paid off. The police officers, stationed nearby as a precaution, heard the commotion and rushed into the house. They intercepted Ethan before he could harm Richard and held him down with proven effectiveness. Ethan struggled to break free from his grip, his curses and accusations echoing throughout the room. She screamed that Richard had ruined her life, that she deserved to suffer for all she had done. His words were filled with despair, a glimpse of the inner turmoil that had driven him to such extremes. Richard, though shocked, kept his composure. He watched silently as the officers handcuffed Ethan and led him toward the door. Through it all, a part of him still mourned the loss of his brother, the man Ethan could have been if he hadn't been consumed by envy and despair. Before Ethan was taken away, Richard stepped forward and asked him one last question. Why had he chosen to resort to such violence? Ethan's response was bitter and defiant. He spat that the success of Richard had always overshadowed him, that he had no choice but to take drastic measures to escape his debts and misery. The answer left Richard speechless. It was not the justification of a desperate man, but the bitter ramblings of one who had allowed hatred to consume him. As Ethan was escorted out, Richard stood in the center of the room, his thoughts heavy with the weight of what had happened. Ethan's arrest left Richard grappling with a complex mix of emotions. The evidence of Ethan's actions was irrefutable, but Richard could not accept that his brother was a simple criminal. Beneath the bitterness and rage, Richard still saw traces of the boy he had grown up with, the boy who had once shared his dreams and ambitions. Despite the gravity of Ethan's actions, Richard felt a responsibility to seek not only justice, but understanding. In the days following the incident, Richard contacted legal experts and psychology professionals to request a comprehensive evaluation of Ethan's mental state. The findings were both enlightening and heartbreaking. Psychologists concluded that Ethan suffered from serious mental health issues, including anxiety, depression, and paranoia, all of which were compounded by years of financial stress and feelings of inadequacy. His inability to seek help or face his failures had created a dangerous spiral, which led him to see his own brother as an enemy rather than a source of support. Richard had to wrestle with the decision of how to proceed. While the law demanded accountability, his own sense of compassion pushed him to take a different path. After much deliberation, Richard took the necessary steps to have Ethan committed to a long-term mental health facility instead of a conventional prison. He believed that treatment and supervision would give Ethan the best chance of recovery and prevent him from posing a danger to himself or others. Although the process was emotionally draining, Richard stood his ground. She worked closely with the facility's medical team, ensuring that Ethan's care plan addressed both his immediate needs and the underlying issues that had driven his fall. Despite the betrayal, Richard's visits to the center became a regular part of his routine. Each visit was a reminder of the bond they once shared and their hope for a final reconciliation. While tending to his brother's needs, Richard also turned his attention to Jamal, the homeless teenager who had saved his life. Deeply grateful for Jamal's courage, Richard tried to learn more about the boy's background. He discovered the hardships Jamal had endured after the loss of his father and the struggles he faced living on the streets. Determined to reward Jamal's bravery with meaningful actions, Richard invited the boy to meet him in his office. During the conversation, Richard assured Jamal that he would take responsibility for his future. She arranged for Jamal to move into a safe and comfortable home, which would provide him with shelter and a sense of stability. Richard also made sure that Jamal's education was a priority. He placed the child in a reputable school, covered all the expenses, and provided him with the necessary resources to succeed. In addition, Richard introduced Jamal to mentors within his company, offering him opportunities to explore his interests and develop skills for a successful career. Over the years, Jamal thrived under Richard's guidance. With access to education and support, she transformed her life, excelling academically and pursuing a career in the business world. Jamal often spoke of Richard's kindness and how he had given him the opportunity to rebuild his life. At public events and at important moments in his life, he credited Richard not only with saving him from a life of hardship, but also with inspiring him to return that kindness to others in need. Meanwhile, Richard continued to visit Ethan at the mental health center. Visits were usually quiet and filled with unexpressed tension, but Richard never gave up hope for a breakthrough. Some days, Ethan seemed more lucid and willing to participate. At other times, he closed in on himself, unable to face his brother. Richard remained patient, believing that time and care could heal even the deepest wounds. The experience left an indelible mark on Richard. The events forced him to confront the fragility of human relationships and the devastating consequences of rampant pain and resentment. Yet, through it all, he had found a renewed sense of purpose. By helping Ethan and Jamal, he had turned a tragedy into an opportunity to create a legacy of healing and hope. Richard's actions did not go unnoticed. Her decision to prioritize compassion over punishment resonated with many people and sparked conversations about mental health and the importance of addressing systemic issues. He became an advocate for mental health awareness and programs that supported at-risk youth, using his influence and resources to bring about meaningful change. On the anniversary of the incident, Richard invited Jamal to dinner with him at his estate. They sat in the garden, surrounded by the glow of soft lights and the buzzing of summer bugs. As they talked, Richard reflected on how far they had come since that fateful day. Jamal, now a confident young man with a bright future, expressed his gratitude once again. He promised to honor Richard's generosity by striving to help others as he had received help. The conversation filled Richard with a sense of satisfaction, a reminder that even in the darkest of moments, there is always the potential for light. Although the scars of the past still lingered, Richard had found a way to move on. His compassion for Ethan and his support for Jamal were testament to his belief in the power of redemption and responsibility. As he looked to the future, Richard knew that his efforts had created a ripple effect of kindness and understanding, which would continue to grow long after the pain of the past had faded. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional, created to highlight themes of bravery, unexpected alliances, and the profound impact of compassion. Its purpose is to raise awareness and inspire empathy in our daily interactions.